My name is Richard Hale. I'm 62 years old, and last December my son's wife looked me in the eyes and told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas dinner because her family wanted to keep their traditions. She didn't say it with a hint of apology. She didn't stumble over her words or try to soften the blow. She said it in that clipped, matter-of-fact tone that people use when they've already decided you don't matter enough to be considered. After hearing it, I said nothing. I did just one thing, and you'll understand at the end of this story why. I've never been the type to make a scene. I've lived too many years, worked too many hours, and swallowed too many words to waste my energy on shouting matches. But don't mistake silence for weakness. I've also learned that the sharpest blade you can use in life is patience. For 5 long years I had been the invisible pillar holding up my son Ethan's life with Claire. I wasn't just giving them the occasional handout. No, I was the reason they still had that roof over their heads. I paid their mortgage every single month without fail. I covered their utilities, their renovations, and every emergency that seemed to come up like clockwork. The total, when I finally sat down and tallied it, it was over $200,000. $200,000. You know what that represents? That's more than a house. That's years of my life. That's the knees I wore down working double shifts. That's the back I hurt hauling equipment at jobs where the only recognition you get is a paycheck with your name spelled right. I'm a maintenance supervisor by trade, the kind of job where your clothes are stained before lunch and your hands are never clean, no matter how much you scrub. I've worked for everything I've ever had. I know what it's like to open the fridge and see only half a loaf of bread and a carton of eggs, and I promised myself that when Ethan grew up, I'd make sure he never had to feel that same kind of pressure. When Ethan and Claire bought their house, it was a mess. The roof leaked so bad during the first rainstorm that they had pots and pans all over the living room. The kitchen wiring was old enough to be a fire hazard. The plumbing sounded like an angry animal whenever you turned on the faucet. They were young, optimistic, and way over their heads. And I couldn't stand by and watch them drown. So I paid. I paid for a brand new roof. I paid for the kitchen to be rewired and updated. I paid the plumber who came out twice when their pipes burst in the middle of winter. I paid their heating bill that winter too when the oil tank ran dry and Ethan called saying they couldn't afford to fill it. I even took out a small personal loan once just to get their mortgage current when they fell behind, because I knew if they lost that house it would break Ethan. The funny thing is, Ethan never came to me directly for money. It was always Claire. She had a way about her, a kind of practiced helplessness. She'd call me in this soft, almost apologetic tone, as if she hated to bother me, but underneath it was an unspoken expectation. "Richard, the contractor says he can't start without payment." "Richard, the mortgage company called again." "Richard, the furnace quit last night, and it's freezing in here." Always urgent, always timed just right, and always leaving me with 2 choices: help or feel like I was letting my own son live in discomfort. I told myself I was helping Ethan. I told myself it was just temporary. I told myself it was what fathers do, and maybe back then I believed it. So, when Claire told me, in her doorway, with her arms crossed and that faint little smile, that I wasn't welcome at Christmas because my parents really value their own traditions, it hit me like a steel-toed boot to the chest. "It's nothing personal," she added. Nothing personal. That phrase is a lie. People tell themselves so they can hurt you without feeling guilty. It's always personal when it's family. I looked at her for a long second. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't demand that Ethan come to the door and say it himself. I didn't even ask what these so-called traditions were that apparently couldn't include me. I just nodded once and said, "All right." That night, I went home to my small, quiet house. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the cheap kind, the kind I'd gotten used to because I'd been funneling so much of my money into someone else's life. I sat at my kitchen table. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, and for the first time in years, the silence felt good. I opened my laptop, logged into my bank account, and stared at the line that said, "Automatic mortgage payment, Ethan and Claire Hale." My hand hovered over the cancel button for maybe 5 seconds. Then I clicked it. And just like that, 5 years of sacrifice ended with one click. No warning, no explanation, no second chances. I didn't do it out of anger, not the kind that makes you slam doors or throw things. No, this was the cold kind, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice, because some lessons need to be felt in the gut, not told in words. And I knew with a kind of quiet certainty that they were about to learn exactly what life feels like without a safety net. It was only 3 days after Claire had told me I wasn't welcome at their Christmas dinner when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw her name. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I answered, not because I wanted to talk to her, but because I was curious. "Richard?" Her voice was sugar-coated, the way people talk when they want something but don't want to admit it yet.
"Yeah," I said flatly.
"So, my car's in the shop. Transmission trouble. They said it might take a couple of days and I've got a bunch of errands to run tomorrow. I was wondering if you could maybe drive me around for the day. You know, help me get things done." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the audacity was so thick you could spread it on toast. This was 3 days after she made it clear I wasn't worth a chair at her Christmas table. 3 days after she drew that invisible line in the sand and put me on the other side of it, and now she wanted me to spend my day chauffeuring her around like a free Uber driver. "No," I said. No explanation. Just one word. There was a pause, the kind that tells you the other person is processing the fact that you didn't fall in line like they expected. "Sorry, what?" she finally said. I said, "No, Claire." Another pause. I could hear her breathing, short and sharp. "Well, wow, that's okay, I guess." But her voice was tight, the kind of tight that says this conversation would be repeated to someone else with her version of the truth. She hung up faster than I expected. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Mark, her father. I'd never liked Mark. The man had a knack for making everything sound like a lecture, even when he was dead wrong. "Richard," he said, skipping any sort of greeting, "I just heard from Claire. She tells me you refused to help her today. Is that true?" "That's right," I said. There was a pause, not because he was shocked, but because he was gearing up to scold me like a child. "I gotta say, I don't get it," Mark went on. "Family's supposed to help family, especially when it's something simple like giving someone a ride." That one hit me sideways. This was coming from the same man who, in all the years Ethan and Claire had been together, hadn't put a single cent into helping them. Not for their mortgage, not for their renovations, not for their bills, and yet here he was, lecturing me on what family was supposed to do. I didn't bother reminding him of that fact. I didn't bother telling him that I'd been paying for his daughter's home for 5 years, while he sat back and hosted barbecues in his perfect, debt-free house. Instead, I just said, "Mark, I've been helping for a long time. I think I've done enough." There was silence on the line, followed by a short, dismissive snort. "Guess I was wrong about you," he said. Then he hung up. By the next morning, the whispers had started. It was small at first. Little comments from people at the diner, sideways glances at the grocery store. Then one of my coworkers told me they'd heard from someone that I'd abandoned my son and daughter-in-law when they needed me most. A few days later, I walked past the newsstand in town and froze. Sitting on the rack was the local paper, and there it was, a neatly written opinion piece in the community section by none other than Mark. The headline was vague but pointed, "When family forgets what family means." He never used my name, but he didn't have to. In a small town, everyone can read between the lines. The piece was dripping with sanctimony about how some people turn their backs on loved ones when they're too proud to help. I read the whole thing standing right there on the sidewalk, and by the end, my jaw was clenched so tight it hurt. That was the moment the quiet disappointment I'd been feeling since Claire's "You're not welcome" turned into something sharper, colder. Not rage, not the kind that burns hot and fades fast. This was steel, and steel takes time to sharpen. They wanted to paint me as selfish? Fine. They wanted to act like I'd never lifted a finger? Fine. But they'd forgotten something important. You can't twist the truth when the receipts are sitting in my filing cabinet, and I was about to use every single one. It was only 3 days after Claire had told me I wasn't welcome at their Christmas dinner when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw her name. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I answered, not because I wanted to talk to her, but because I was curious. "Richard?" Her voice was sugar-coated, the way people talk when they want something but don't want to admit it yet. "Yeah," I said flatly. "So, my car's in the shop. Transmission trouble. They said it might take a couple of days, and I've got a bunch of errands to run tomorrow. I was wondering if you could maybe drive me around for the day. Help me get things done." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the audacity was so thick you could spread it on toast. This was 3 days after she made it clear I wasn't worth a chair at her Christmas table. 3 days after she drew that invisible line in the sand and put me on the other side of it, and now she wanted me to spend my day chauffeuring her around like a free Uber driver. "No," I said. No explanation, just one word. There was a pause, the kind that tells you the other person is processing the fact that you didn't fall in line like they expected. "Sorry, what?" she finally said. I said, "No, Claire." Another pause. I could hear her breathing, short and sharp. "Well, wow. That's okay, I guess." But her voice was tight. The kind of tight that says this conversation would be repeated to someone else, with her version of the truth. She hung up faster than I expected. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 hours later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Mark, her father. I'd never liked Mark. The man had a knack for making everything sound like a lecture, even when he was dead wrong. "Richard," he said, skipping any sort of greeting, "I just heard from Claire. She tells me you refused to help her today. Is that true?" "That's right," I said. There was a pause, not because he was shocked, but because he was gearing up to scold me like a child. "I gotta say, I don't get it," Mark went on. "Family's supposed to help family, especially when it's something simple like giving someone a ride." That one hit me sideways. This was coming from the same man who, in all the years Ethan and Claire had been together, hadn't put a single cent into helping them. Not for their mortgage, not for their renovations, not for their bills, and yet here he was, lecturing me on what family was supposed to do. I didn't bother reminding him of that fact. I didn't bother telling him that I'd been paying for his daughter's home for 5 years, while he sat back and hosted barbecues in his perfect, debt-free house. Instead, I just said, "Mark, I've been helping for a long time. I think I've done enough." There was silence on the line, followed by a short, dismissive snort. "Guess I was wrong about you," he said. Then he hung up. By the next morning, the whispers had started. It was small at first. Little comments from people at the diner, sideways glances at the grocery store. Then one of my co-workers told me they'd heard from someone that I'd abandoned my son and daughter-in-law when they needed me most. A few days later, I walked past the newsstand in town and froze. Sitting on the rack was the local paper, and there it was, a neatly written opinion piece in the community section by none other than Mark. The headline was vague but pointed. "When family forgets what family means." He never used my name, but he didn't have to. In a small town, everyone can read between the lines. The piece was dripping with sanctimony about how some people turn their backs on loved ones when they're too proud to help. I read the whole thing standing right there on the sidewalk, and by the end my jaw was clenched so tight it hurt. That was the moment the quiet disappointment I'd been feeling since Claire's "You're not welcome" turned into something sharper, colder. Not rage. Not the kind that burns hot and fades fast. This was steel, and steel takes time to sharpen. They wanted to paint me as selfish? Fine. They wanted to act like I'd never lifted a finger? Fine. But they'd forgotten something important. You can't twist the truth when the receipts are sitting in my filing cabinet, and I was about to use every single one. When people lie about you, you have two choices. You can defend yourself right away, shouting into the storm, or you can let the storm pass, gather your weapons, and hit them when the sun comes out and everyone's watching. I chose the second. The morning after I read Mark's little sermon in the paper, I went straight to the spare room in my house. That's where I keep my desk, the filing cabinet and a stack of old bankers' boxes full of receipts, bills and tax returns. I've always been the kind of man who keeps records. I never imagined those records would be used for something like this, but life has a way of surprising you. I pulled open the cabinet drawer labeled Ethan and Claire and started going through it. Mortgage payment confirmations, bank transfer printouts, copies of checks I'd written for their home renovations, the kitchen remodel, the roof repair after the hailstorm, the basement waterproofing. I had it all. Every month for 5 years, I'd made their mortgage payment directly to the bank. I'd started the first month after they got the house, when Ethan had called me, embarrassed, saying they were a little short after the wedding. I didn't just cover that first month. I told him I'd handle the mortgage until they were steady. Steady never came. As I sorted the papers, I started to remember the details. The summer Claire wanted a new deck because the old one wasn't Instagram worthy. She had her heart set on cedar planks and a custom railing. That was $9,800. I paid the contractor directly. The winter the furnace went out, Ethan called me late at night. Claire was pregnant, and the house was freezing. I paid $4,600 for a new system. The time their basement flooded because they hadn't cleaned the gutters, $2,300 to a plumber I'd met once before. Renovations, bills, emergencies, vacations disguised as getaways for mental health. I even covered their property taxes 2 years in a row when unexpected expenses hit them, expenses that in reality were new furniture and a trip to Cancun. By the time I was done with that first pass through the files, I had a stack of papers almost 4 inches thick. That night, I drove to the office supply store. I bought a heavy-duty binder, black, 3-inch rings, and a pack of plastic sleeves. I wanted this thing to look professional, undeniable. I slid each piece of proof into a sleeve, arranging them in perfect chronological order, starting with the very first mortgage payment and ending with the most recent one I'd made before cancelling. On the inside cover, I put a single sheet, total financial support rendered to Ethan and Claire from 2018 to 2023, $200,000. And under it, in bold, I typed, every cent documented, every transaction dated, every payment mine. It was more than numbers. It was 5 years of my life, 5 years of sacrifices I'd never complained about. I didn't stop there. I started calling people quietly. The contractor who built the deck, the electrician who rewired the kitchen during the remodel, the plumber who fixed the basement flooding. I explained that I was putting together a personal record and asked for copies of their old invoices. Most of them remembered me right away. "Yeah, I remember you," one said. "You're the dad who paid in cash, so your son didn't have to worry." Another laughed. "Oh yeah, you're the one who insisted on paying extra for the better materials." By the end of the week, I had not just receipts and bank records, but third-party invoices, each with my name on them, each tied to a specific job at Ethan and Claire's house. When I slid the last page into its sleeve and closed the binder, it made a satisfying thunk on the desk. That sound was the sound of preparation. I locked it in the bottom drawer and sat back in my chair. This wasn't something I was going to wave around in a fit of anger. No, this was a precision weapon, and like any weapon, timing would be everything. I knew one thing for sure. When I brought this out, it would be in a place where they couldn't lie their way out. They had turned me into the villain in their story. I was about to hand the audience the real script. There's an old saying I've always believed in: measure twice, cut once. It's a carpenter's phrase, but it works just as well in life. If you're going to make a move, especially a move you can't take back, you make damn sure you've thought it through, lined everything up, and you know exactly where you're going to strike. After I read Mark's little community wisdom piece in the paper, the one where he didn't have the guts to name me but described me in such detail everyone knew who it was about, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to give him or Claire the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. I wasn't going to call Ethan and demand an apology. No. I was going to get my hands dirty in a different way, the kind of way that doesn't leave mud on you but leaves the other guy buried up to his neck in it. So, the next morning, I woke up early. It was barely light outside. The frost on the grass looked like a thin layer of sugar, and my coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen like it always does. I didn't even bother turning on the TV. I went straight to the small spare room at the end of the hall. Most people would call it an office, but it's more of a catch-all for things I want to keep close. Old tools, boxes of winter clothes, a filing cabinet, and a battered oak desk I've had for 30 years. The surface is scratched from all the times I've slid boxes or stacks of paper across it, but it's sturdy like me. I sat down, unlocked the bottom drawer of the cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder labeled, in black marker, Ethan and Claire, House. I didn't write that label thinking I'd one day need it in a fight. I wrote it because I'm the kind of man who keeps track of his money, where it goes, when it goes, and what it's for. The folder was heavy. Inside were years' worth of bank statements, copies of checks, printed receipts from online transfers, and a few handwritten notes I'd jotted on post-its to remind myself about conversations we'd had. I put the folder on the desk, and when I opened it, the smell of paper and printer ink hit me. Funny thing, that smell took me right back to the very first payment I'd ever made for them. It was February, 5 years ago. Ethan had called me on a Sunday evening. I remember I was watching an old Western on TV, feet up in my recliner. He sounded nervous. He said, "Dad, I hate to ask, but we're a little short on the mortgage this month. You know, after the wedding and all." I didn't even let him finish. I told him I'd cover it, but I didn't just cover that month. I told him I'd handle the mortgage until they got on their feet. Back then, I thought that would be maybe 3 months, 4 tops. I slid the first page out of the folder. A payment confirmation from my bank to theirs. I could still see the amount clear as day. $1,642.288. I smiled a little, not because it was funny, but because that one payment had been the start of the slow bleed I hadn't noticed until now. I started stacking the papers in order, payment after payment, month after month. Then I came across the deck project. Oh, I remembered that one well. Claire had been scrolling through some home design site, showing Ethan pictures of cedar decks with fancy railings. She said the old one wasn't Instagram-worthy. Ethan tried to soften it when he told me about it. Said the wood was starting to rot, but when I went over, I saw the old deck. It was fine. Not pretty, but fine. I still paid $9,800 to the contractor, because Ethan said Claire would really appreciate it. I kept sorting. There was the furnace replacement, $4,600 in the dead of winter. That one I didn't even think twice about. Claire was pregnant then, and I couldn't stand the thought of my future grandchild coming into a freezing house. There were the property taxes, twice, around $3,200 each year. Ethan had called both times, saying there'd been unexpected expenses. Later I found out one of those unexpected expenses was a trip to Cancun. The other was a set of new living room furniture. There were so many more. The basement flooding, $2,300 to a plumber. The kitchen remodel, over $12,000, mostly for appliances that still had the protective stickers on them 6 months later because Claire said she hadn't had the time to cook. It was endless. Every page I pulled from that folder was another reminder of how many times I'd said yes. I didn't keep going out of anger. I kept going because I realized something important. If they were going to paint me as the villain, I was going to make sure every single stroke of that painting had the truth written under it. By noon, I had a pile of papers almost 4 inches thick. I drove down to the office supply store in town. The smell of new cardboard hit me as I walked in, and I went straight to the aisle with binders. I picked out a heavy-duty black one, 3-inch rings, the kind that feels solid in your hands. I grabbed 2 packs of clear plastic sleeves too. Back at home, I sat at the desk and started sliding each piece of proof into a sleeve. Mortgage payments first, in perfect chronological order, then renovation payments, then emergency expenses, then miscellaneous bills I'd covered. It took hours. By the time I finished, the winter sun was already slipping down behind the trees outside my window. My back ached from leaning over the desk, but the binder looked beautiful, professional, undeniable. On the inside cover, I put a single sheet of paper I'd typed up. Total financial support rendered to Ethan and Claire, 2018. Underneath, in bold, I wrote, every cent documented, every transaction dated, every payment mine. Then I sat back in my chair and stared at that page for a while. I let the number sink in. $200,000, more than some people make in 4 years. More than I'd ever spent on myself in that time. And for what? For a "you're not welcome at Christmas dinner" from a woman who wouldn't have a house without me. But I wasn't done. Not even close. The next step was to make sure no one could claim these were just my version of events. I started making calls. The contractor who built the cedar deck. He remembered me right away. "Oh yeah," he said. "You're the dad who insisted on paying for the better wood. Didn't your son want to go cheaper?" The electrician who had rewired the kitchen during the remodel. He dug up the old invoice and emailed me a scanned copy. My name on it, clear as day. The plumber who fixed the basement. "So I remember you," he said. "You paid in cash, right?" Said your son was dealing with enough stress already. By the end of the week, I had third-party invoices for almost every major job done on that house, all with my name, not Ethan's. I added them to the binder, each one tucked neatly into a sleeve, labeled with the date and the amount. I even put sticky notes on a few pages where I had texts from Ethan or Claire begging for help, just so I could show the connection between the request and the payment. When I slid the last page into its sleeve and closed the binder, it made a deep, solid thunk. That sound was more satisfying than I can explain. I locked the binder in the bottom drawer of my desk, not because I was afraid someone would take it, but because it felt like putting a weapon back in its case. I wasn't ready to swing it yet. I was going to wait for the perfect time, and when that time came, I'd open the case, take out the weapon, and let the truth cut through every lie they'd told. The funny thing, I wasn't even angry anymore, not in the yelling, shouting, throw things sense. What I felt was colder, sharper, the kind of focus a hunter feels when he's already spotted the deer and is just waiting for it to step into the clearing. They thought they'd gotten rid of me. They thought they could humiliate me quietly and go on with their perfect little holiday. But I had news for them. They hadn't seen anything yet. The binder sat in my desk drawer like a coiled snake, heavy, silent, ready to strike, when I decided the moment was right. Thing about revenge, the good kind, the cold kind, is that you don't rush it. The difference between a petty outburst and a masterpiece of payback is timing. You don't just need the truth. You need the right stage to present it on. The stage where the liars can't look away, and neither can anyone else. That stage came to me one cold Tuesday morning, about 2 weeks before Christmas. I was sitting in the local diner, the kind with sticky menus and a waitress who calls everyone Homan. I like the place because it's quiet in the mornings, and you can get a decent cup of coffee without feeling like you're paying for someone's vacation home. I was halfway through a plate of scrambled eggs when I heard the voices from the next booth. 2 women in puffy coats were talking, and even though I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, a name caught my attention. Claire, my daughter-in-law. She's hosting again this year, one of them said. Big fancy thing, invited the church ladies and their husbands. You know how she likes to make a show of it. The other one laughed. Oh, I know. Last year she rented those gold-rimmed plates, said she wanted it to look like something out of a magazine. I bet her parents will be there front and center, acting like they own the place. I sipped my coffee and kept my face neutral, but inside, something clicked into place. I'd been waiting for a way to do this that didn't make me look like the bitter old father who couldn't handle being left out. But a public event, filled with their friends, their church group, and half the people they try to impress, that wasn't just an opportunity, it was an invitation. I left the diner with my mind spinning. The cold air hit me as I stepped outside, but it didn't slow me down. I went home, sat at my desk, and pulled out the binder. I opened it and flipped through the pages slowly, letting the weight of each documented payment sink in again. This wasn't just proof. This was a story, a 5-year story of sacrifice, generosity, and frankly stupidity on my part for letting it go on so long. And like any good story, it deserved an audience. I started making a list in my notebook. Names. Mrs. Harris, the neighbor who always brought cookies when Ethan and Claire first moved in. Frank and Delia from the church committee. Mr. Miller, who coached Ethan's Little League team and had known him since he was 9 years old. The Smiths, who ran the local grocery store and had once let Claire run a tab because times were tough. All of them were people. Claire and her family would be desperate to impress. All of them were also people who'd hear a public accounting of the truth and never forget it. Over the next few days, I kept my ears open. I found out that their big Christmas dinner was going to be on the Saturday before Christmas. They'd rented the banquet room at the Pinecrest Country Club, classy but not so expensive that it would raise eyebrows, especially if you didn't know whose money was paying for it. Perfect. I knew I wasn't on the guest list. That was fine. I didn't need an invitation. I had something better, a delivery. I called my old friend Jack, who runs a small print shop downtown. He's one of those guys who knows how to keep his mouth shut, which is exactly what I needed. I told him I needed 50 copies of a packet, professionally printed, each page clear as day. I brought him the binder and showed him exactly what I wanted duplicated. "Are you sure you want to go this route?" he asked, raising an eyebrow as he flipped through the pages. "I'm sure," I said. "Every single word in here is true. Every number is backed up. I'm not telling a story, I'm showing one." He nodded slowly. "All right, I'll make them look sharp." 3 days later, I picked up a box from Jack's shop. Inside were 50 pristine packets, each with a glossy cover page that read, "The Truth About 5 Years of Family Support, documented by Richard Thompson, December." I spent that night carefully sliding each packet into a red gift bag. I tied each bag with gold ribbon. They looked festive, almost cheerful. If you didn't know what was inside, you'd think you were getting cookies or homemade fudge. The plan was simple. I'd walk into the banquet, gift bags in hand, and start handing them out one by one. No yelling, no name-calling, just the quiet delivery of truth, wrapped in holiday colors. The more I thought about it, the calmer I felt. This wasn't about getting even anymore. This was about reclaiming my dignity, about making sure people knew I wasn't the selfish, bitter old man Claire's parents had painted me to be. The week before the dinner, I kept to myself. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't call Claire. I didn't drop hints to anyone in town. The element of surprise was too important. On the morning of the big day, I woke up before sunrise. I made myself a strong cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and just breathed. I thought about the last 5 years, about every time I'd written a check without thinking twice, about every time I'd told myself, "They're young, they'll appreciate this someday," and about the way it had all ended, with Claire telling me I wasn't welcome at Christmas dinner because it's just family this year. I smiled to myself. "Family," I muttered under my breath. Around 3 in the afternoon, I loaded the gift bags into the back of my truck. The country club was only 15 minutes away, but I left early. I wanted to be there before dessert. That way, people would have eaten. The wine would have loosened tongues, and no one would see me coming until I was standing in the doorway. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw the cars lined up. Claire's parents' shiny SUV was parked right up front. Ethan's sedan was next to it. I could almost hear their voices inside, laughing, telling some story about how hard the last few years had been. I parked near the back, out of sight. I sat there for a minute, gripping the steering wheel, feeling the slow, steady thump of my heart. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I grabbed the box of gift bags, stepped out into the cold air, and walked toward the entrance. The lobby of the Pinecrest Country Club smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon. A big Christmas tree stood in the corner, covered in white lights and shiny red ornaments. The receptionist smiled politely, assuming I was another guest. When I reached the door to the banquet room, I could hear the laughter and the clinking of glasses. I took a deep breath, adjusted the box in my arms, and pushed the door open. Every head turned. Claire's smile froze on her face. Ethan looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Her parents, well, if looks could kill, I'd have been on the floor. "Richard," Claire said, her voice just a touch too high. "We weren't expecting you." "I know," I said, smiling as warmly as I could manage. I just wanted to drop off some gifts for everyone. I stepped inside, and the room fell silent, except for the sound of my boots on the carpet. One by one, I handed a red bag to each table, smiling at the confused faces. "Merry Christmas," I said, over and over. Some people peeked inside their bags right away. Others waited until everyone had one, but within seconds, the sound of paper rustling filled the room, followed by the low murmur of people reading. It didn't take long. You could see it on their faces, the shock, the disbelief, the quick glances toward Ethan and Claire. I didn't say a word. I just kept moving, making sure every single guest had their own packet. When I finished, I stood at the front of the room, looked straight at Claire's parents and said, "I thought everyone should know the truth. Merry Christmas." Then I turned, walked out, and left them to stew in it. As I stepped into the cold night air, I felt lighter than I had in years. The stage had been perfect, and the show had only just begun. When I got home after my quiet dinner alone that night, the one that should have been Christmas with my family, I didn't bother turning on the television. I just sat at the kitchen table with a cup of strong black coffee, staring at the evidence binder I'd been building piece by piece for months. The receipts, the bank transfers, the cancelled checks, every dollar I had given them was in there, organized like a legal case file. The binder was heavy, both in weight and meaning. I had been keeping it, not out of spite at first, but out of habit, a lifetime of keeping records, being precise, making sure nothing got lost. Now, though, I realized it was more than just paperwork. It was my shield, my sword, and my insurance policy rolled into one. 3 days before Christmas, I decided to make a move. I didn't call to demand an invitation. I didn't beg for a place at the table. No, that would have been giving them the satisfaction of thinking I still needed them. Instead, I called Ethan with the most polite, casual voice I could muster. "Hey son, just wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas in advance." For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Just the faint sound of voices and music in the background. Then Ethan's voice came, hesitant but friendly enough. "Thanks, Dad." Yeah, Merry Christmas to you too." It was what I heard next that told me everything I needed to know. In the background, a voice I knew all too well, Claire's, carried clearly through the line, dripping with mockery. "He's probably home alone with his cheap coffee, watching old movies again." She didn't even lower her voice. She wanted me to hear it. That was the kind of woman she was, the kind who preferred to cut a person in small, quiet ways, so the wound stung but didn't bleed. Ethan didn't respond to her. Maybe he thought pretending not to hear would make it better, but the damage was done. I didn't snap. I didn't hang up. I just kept my tone even, polite. "Well, I hope you all have a wonderful time. Take care of yourselves." I ended the call without giving them a chance to respond. Not an hour later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from none other than Lisa, Mark's wife. Mark, of course, being Claire's older brother, the one who'd inherited his parents' smug arrogance like it was a family heirloom. The text read, "Merry Christmas, Richard. Hope you're keeping warm. We're having such a full house this year. So many laughs. Would have been nice if you could have been part of it. But you know, tradition." She even added a winking face emoji at the end. It wasn't a greeting. It was bait, pure bait. The kind you throw into the water when you want to see if the fish is dumb enough to bite. I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone down without replying. Not a word. Not a single keystroke. I wasn't going to give her or them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten to me. Instead, I poured myself another coffee and went back to the binder. Every page was already in order. But I wasn't just thinking about order. I was thinking about presentation. If I was going to pull the trigger on this, it had to be precise. Not a messy emotional outburst, but a surgical strike. I opened my printer and began making photocopies. Not just one or two, but enough to hand out to everyone who mattered. The kind of people who formed the backbone of their social circle, their church committee friends, the neighborhood busybodies who loved nothing more than a good piece of gossip, the couple down the street who always hosted the summer barbecue and thought they were the gatekeepers of suburban respectability. As the printer hummed and sheets slid into the tray, I thought about how much time and money I had sunk into that family. Over $200,000 over the years, the mortgage payments, the house renovations, the bills they couldn't cover. I thought about the times I'd gone without upgrades for myself so they could keep living like everything was fine. And for what? So I could be told in so many words that I wasn't welcome, that my presence didn't fit their traditions. No, I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to send angry texts. I was going to let the truth walk right through their front door, in my hands, in their faces, in front of the very people they wanted to impress. But timing was everything. You can't rush a trap, not if you want it to close perfectly. That's why, in those last days before Christmas, I played it cool. I went about my business. I waved to neighbors. I dropped a few casual hints to people I knew would be at their Christmas dinner, asking if they were looking forward to the party. I could see the curiosity flicker in their eyes. That was good. Curiosity makes people pay closer attention. At night, I rehearsed what I would say. Not much, just enough to set the scene before I let the papers speak for themselves. I wanted my words to land like a scalpel, not a hammer. By the time Christmas Eve rolled around, the binder was ready, the copies were stacked, and my plan was airtight. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that their little comments, their snide asides, their deliberate exclusion, had done more than hurt my feelings. They had freed me. Freed me from any sense of obligation to keep protecting their image. And in just 24 hours I was going to take that freedom and turn it into the kind of cold, sweet revenge they'd never forget. Christmas night came cold and sharp, the kind of winter evening where the air stings your cheeks and every breath hangs in the air like smoke. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, buttoning my shirt. Nothing fancy, just a clean, pressed white shirt, dark slacks, and my best pair of brown leather shoes. The clothes of a working man who takes pride in his appearance, not someone trying to impress. I wasn't there to compete with their polished, store-bought image. I was there to end it. The streets were quiet as I drove toward Claire's parents' house, the kind of well-kept neighborhood where people hang matching wreaths and string their Christmas lights with a ruler. Each house was glowing with warm yellow windows, the muffled sound of laughter drifting through the cold. When I turned onto their street, I could already see the cars lining the curb. Expensive sedans, a couple of shiny SUVs, the kind of vehicles that made statements about their owners before the engine even started. I parked at the far end, where the street lamp flickered. I didn't want to announce my arrival too early. The walk up to their house felt longer than it was. I could hear music from inside, Bing Crosby of course, because nothing says tradition like predictable nostalgia. Laughter spilled from the dining room, loud and careless, the sound of people who believed the world was perfectly arranged for them. When I stepped onto the porch, the smell of roast turkey and cinnamon hit me. I stood there for a moment, hand hovering over the doorknob. My heart wasn't racing, it was steady, almost unnervingly so. I had no doubts, no hesitation. Tonight wasn't about me asking for a place at the table. It was about giving them exactly what they'd earned. I pushed the door open. The room went still in waves. First, the people near the door stopped talking and turned to see who it was. Then their eyes widened, and the murmurs started. Claire froze mid-laugh, her wine glass halfway to her mouth. Ethan's eyes darted between me and her, panic blooming across his face. Mark was on his feet almost instantly, moving toward me with that stiff, fake smile people wear when they want to look polite but feel threatened. "Richard, I think you might be at the wrong." I cut him off gently, but firmly. "I won't take much of your time. I just want to give out a few gifts." The smile faltered. He didn't step aside, but I walked past him anyway. The dining room was full, faces I recognized from church events, neighborhood gatherings, and a few I didn't know. The good chairs were all taken, of course, but I didn't need a seat. I reached into the leather satchel I'd brought with me. Inside was a neat stack of cream-colored envelopes. No wrapping paper, no ribbons, just plain envelopes with the kind of weight that made you instinctively want to look inside. I started handing them out, one by one, to the couple at the far end of the table who owned the hardware store, to the pastor's wife, to the man from the city council who had shaken my hand once at a fundraiser. Each person took an envelope, looking puzzled but curious. Claire's voice cracked through the air, high and tight. "What is this supposed to be?" I ignored her and handed an envelope to Ethan last. Then I stepped back, my hands resting calmly at my sides. "In those envelopes," I said, my voice steady and even, "you'll find something I've been keeping track of for the past 5 years. Payment receipts, bank transfers, proof of every mortgage payment, every home repair, every bill I covered for Ethan and Claire, every emergency they brought to my door." I let the words settle for a moment. "The total," I continued, "is just over $200,000. I never asked for it back, never once mentioned it in public. I gave it because I believed I was helping family." I glanced toward Claire, who sat frozen, her knuckles white around her wineglass. "But a few weeks ago I was told I wasn't welcome here for Christmas. Not because I'd done anything wrong, not because of some falling out. No, I was told it was to keep traditions. That's when I decided the tradition of me quietly paying for this family's comfort was over." The room was dead silent. No one shuffled. No one cleared their throat. Even the clink of cutlery had stopped. "I didn't come here to argue," I said. "I'm not here to insult anyone. I just think that if people are going to talk about family values, about generosity, about who belongs and who doesn't, they should have the full picture." I gestured toward the envelopes. "That's the picture." No raised voice, no anger. Just the truth, laid bare in black ink on white paper. I looked at Ethan for a moment, just long enough for him to see there was no begging left in me. Then I turned to leave, my steps slow and measured, the same way you'd walk out of a job on the last day when you know you'll never be back. Behind me, the murmurs began again, low at first, then louder, the sound of reputations cracking under the weight of facts. And I didn't look back once. The day after Christmas, the silence in my house felt different, not the kind of lonely, quiet people dread, but the heavy, satisfied silence of a man who's just finished a job exactly the way he planned. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't answer calls. I just sat with my coffee, the cheap coffee Claire had mocked, and thought about the look on her face when I started handing out those envelopes. It didn't take long for the ripples to start. By mid-morning, I got a text from a man I barely knew, one of the local business owners who'd been at that dinner. "Richard, wow, I had no idea. People need to know what you've done for them." By evening, the first whispers had already turned into full-blown conversations. The kind of small-town talk that moves faster than the mail. I didn't have to lift a finger. The guests were doing all the work. I heard that 2 of the church board members called Mark the next day, asking if what I'd said was true. Mark apparently tried to spin it, saying I'd exaggerated the amount and that I was holding grudges. But the problem with lying in a room full of people holding proof is that no one has to take your word for it. They just open the envelope and read. 3 days later, I ran into a friend at the hardware store. He told me the dinner had been the most awkward Christmas gathering anyone could remember. People left earlier than usual. The pastor's wife was seen shaking her head as she walked out. The city council member apparently said something about trust and character before making a polite exit. And then came the real hit. By the first week of January, I overheard, through the same small-town grapevine, that Ethan and Claire were struggling to make their mortgage. Without my monthly deposits, the numbers didn't add up. They had been living as if the money would always be there, as if I was some kind of invisible foundation holding their house together. Now the cracks were showing. 2 months in, I heard they'd missed a payment. By March, they were 2 months behind. The bank had started calling. Claire's parents, who had built their image on being the kind of people who never asked for help, suddenly found themselves with fewer invitations, fewer conversations, fewer friends willing to stop and chat in the grocery store. I'd see Mark sometimes in the parking lot at the gas station, and he'd look away before I could even nod. That's the thing about truth. Once it's out, it doesn't just hang over you, it follows you. It was early April when my phone rang. Ethan. His voice was different, softer, no forced casualness, no defensive edge, just a tired kind of humility. "Dad, can we meet?" I paused, let the silence stretch. "Sure," I said finally, "you pick the place." And just like that, the stage was set for the last conversation we were ever going to have about money. We met on a Tuesday morning at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where the tables wobble slightly and the coffee tastes like someone still cares about making it right. I got there first, sat at a corner table where I could see the door. When Ethan walked in, I noticed 2 things immediately: the deep lines around his eyes and the way his shoulders slumped forward. He looked older than 38. Stress ages a man faster than time ever could. He sat down without a smile, just a slow exhale. "Dad, I'm sorry." I didn't say anything, just looked at him, waiting. "I let Claire's family influence me," he said. "I didn't defend you when I should have. I thought keeping the peace was more important than speaking up. I was wrong." The words hung between us. I could tell they cost him to say. "We're behind on the mortgage," he continued, "and the truth is, I don't know how to fix it. I'm asking if you'd consider helping us out, just until we get back on our feet." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Ethan, I forgave you the moment you called. I don't hold anger anymore." He let out a small breath, almost relieved, until I went on. "But I'm not going to fund your life again. I'm not stepping back into that role. If you want to keep your house, you'll need to figure that out yourselves." He stared at the table for a long moment. "So, that's it?" "That's it," I said. "I'll be your father. I'll talk to you. I'll share meals. I'll help in ways that are about family, not finances. But our relationship will not be built on my bank account anymore. Respect is the only currency I'll accept from now on." We sat in silence for a few minutes. Eventually he nodded. "I understand." When I left the cafe, the air felt lighter. The morning sun was warm on my face, and for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the invisible weight of someone else's responsibilities on my shoulders. As I walked to my truck, I thought about that Christmas night, about the look in Claire's eyes when the truth landed on the table like a cold stone. And I knew I'd done exactly what needed to be done. I didn't lose a son that Christmas. I lost a debt collector who happened to share my last name.